Hello everyone, this is Gene and I'm back with another video. So I wanted to discuss something today that is been very prevalent recently and that many channels have touched upon, and I wanted to cover it but in a different way. So what I wanted to talk about is censorship. I've been seeing a lot of videos and hearing a lot of opinions regarding censorship, in particular censorship of anime, right? And at least from what I've heard recently, now even Amazon is no longer selling uh, anime like dolls or toys or something to that effect because of this fear that supposedly that anime or certain types of anime that have female characters drawn in a certain way somehow promote child abuse or child exploitation. So I just wanted to go over the history of censorship, or at least a small section of it, right? The history of censorship, at least as I know it, and then discuss the problems with trying to censor. Well, not just censor, but the problems with also trying to ban a work, especially one that comes from a culture and a country that is not your own. So let's get a few things clear here, right? Censorship will always be something that is around and that will always be up for debate. So long as there are decency standards, so long as there are cultural and social norms, and so long as there are people who are moral guardians and who go think of the children, there will always be issues of censorship. What should be censored, what should not be censored. Let's go over a few examples. Back in the 50s, Elvis was censored. For example, many TV shows of the day would not photograph him. When he did live performances, they would not photograph him from the waist up because they found his dance routine, in particular the movement of his legs and the movement of his hips, a bit too provocative and risque for the day. He wouldn't be the only person to have that issue brought up to him when it came to his dancing. But moving on. And then, of course, there's the localization and therefore censorship of several video games, which has been going on for as long as I think video games have been ported to different countries. For example, the original Castlevania, for example, censored a lot of items because of religious concerns. So it removed the religious references or iconography. For example, the Holy Cross, right, became the boomerang, which is what I called it as a little kid playing Castlevania because I didn't know any different, right? And the firebomb, or rather I should say the holy water, which is what it was known in Japan because it was uncensored. But when it came to America, it was the holy water became the firebomb. And in fact, the name, right, the English translation, the English name of the series, Castlevania, however you want to say it, is actually because it's named as such because from what I read in the original Japanese version, the title translates to Devil Castle Dracula. If you were to translate it in English, well, the head of Konami America at that time, back in the mid and late 80s, was very concerned about how that name would be received, given that video games at the time and the Nintendo Entertainment System in particular were promoted in America as a in all ages sort of family toy, right? Even the Japanese name, right, Famicom, stands for family computer. So they were very concerned at that time how it might be perceived, right, and how it might be received. So all the religious references were removed. So instead of Devil Castle Dracula or Satan Castle Dracula, it became Castlevania or Castlevania. Right? And then there are other examples, such as the Final Fight games by Capcom. In the original Japanese version, when you get to the bonus stage and you bust up the car, what the owner of the car shouts is, "Oh my God!" That's in the original Japanese version. In the American version, in the localized, I should say North American, because it goes by regions. So in the localized North American version, it became "Oh my car," because again, the concern about religious references. Speaking of cars, what is it with Capcom and busting up cars in bonus stages? Someone explain this to me. But since I have a Street Fighter image here, let's talk about Street Fighter. See, back in the early 90s when Street Fighter 2 came out, this stage, Sagat's stage, and in particular the statue in his stage, became a bit of controversy because the area that you see right beneath her head, right, that part of her chest, well, that's supposed to be an exposed breast. Not that any kid who was playing this game knew that, and I know that because I was 7 and playing this game back in 1992, and a breast, I wasn't thinking it. I don't think I even knew what they were at that time. But I certainly didn't think it was anything that was nude or naked. Didn't even cross my mind. But once it was discovered what this statue was supposed to be, which to my knowledge is actually based on a real life statue in Thailand, right? But games after this, Street Fighter games after this that would feature Sagat's stage, and the statue would feature the statue with the offending breast covered up, as we see here from this image from, I believe, Street Fighter V. And then there was, of course, the big name change. For, I think if you're on this channel, you probably know, but just to recap, in the Japanese version of Street Fighter, and possibly in the European version, I don't know, but I know certainly in the Japanese version of Street Fighter, the 4 Grandmasters, right? The Boxer, Claw, Sagat, and the Dictator, right? They all had their names switched. In the original Japanese version, right, the Boxer is referred to as the Boxer is referred to as M. Bison, right? So that's who we have here, Mike Bison. I'll explain why that's important in a minute. But you had Mike Bison, he's the Boxer. Then the Claw, right? The man with the claw and the mask was referred to as Balrog. And then you had the Dictator in red known as Vega. Well, because Capcom was afraid that they might be sued by some boxer in the 80s, he was kind of popular. His name was Mike Tyson or something. I forget. It's been a long time. But anyway, they were afraid of being sued because of the likeness between Mike Bison and Mike Tyson. So the names got switched around. So the Boxer became Balrog, the Masked Man became Vega, and M. Bison became the Dictator in red. Interestingly enough, only one character kept his name consistent in between the Japanese version and the American, or North American, I should say, North American release. This guy, the bald dude with the eye patch. So there's that, right? So moving on. Then we get into the realm of cartoons, and in particular cartoons based on comic books. One example is X-Men, right? The X-Men cartoon, for example, while it's considered one of the best adaptations of the comics of that time, what many people have noticed, especially looking back on the series now, is that Wolverine was never allowed to cut anything that could bleed. He was usually allowed to attack robots or other beings that could not really be injured by him, or, again, couldn't bleed, but he was never allowed to attack, regular flesh and blood people. Threaten them, sure, but never actually attack them. Another instance of censorship via adaptation is the fight between Callisto and Storm. In the TV version of this fight, they fight with bow staff lightsabers. This is the best way I can describe it. Whereas in the comic proper, issue 170, if people are interested, in the comic proper, it was a knife fight to the death. So there's always been censorship, especially censorship via adaptation or localization or change. So another example, in particular in anime, is Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, which is dubbed by Funimation, or just Funimation in general. Funimation has been caught numerous times mistranslating, or at least some people would say mistranslating the translations of the original language anime and putting in, I guess, what's the term I would use? Putting in current day, I guess you could say, buzzwords. That's a good term. Current day buzzwords that would not fit in the text. For example, I believe Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, there was a reference to, or rather, Funimation added a reference to misogyny or patriarchy. Something to that effect. They've also been caught adapting Prison School and several other dubs and translations that many fans feel is Funimation adding what was not originally there to the text. In fact, although it's not Funimation, I saw recently in a video that, I believe the video was by Danfan29, where she talks about how another dubbing company, right, the one that adapts To Love Ru, right, how they took a line where in the original language there's something about a woman being able to cook, right, and I guess a man being interested in a woman being able to cook. And in the original translation, right, in the original language, one of the females talking says, well, that's old-fashioned. Whereas in the translation, right, in the dub, I should say, in the dub translation, that's old-fashioned became that's misogynistic, right? Entirely two different terms and with entirely different meanings and connotations. So anime fans have been very much, I would guess you would say, aware or hyper aware of when American dubbing companies do these things. And of course, it goes the other way. It's not just works coming in to North America that get adapted and changed and censored. It's also works going out. For example, the Mortal Kombat games, at least back in the day. This clip comes from Mortal Kombat 2. Interestingly enough, the censorship back in the day for MK2 wasn't just in America. It was also in Japan, of all places, where the Japanese version of MK2 had the blood changed from red to green, and when you got to the fatality, a black and white, the screen would change to black and white while the character did the fatality. Now, I will admit, I do find this a bit hypocritical, to be honest, of Japan, then and now, because A, they're kind of known for incredibly violent anime, and 2, they have games like Samurai Showdown, which features stuff like this. Okay? This was made in Japan for a Japanese audience. This is Samurai Showdown, I think, 4 or 5? Right? But this character here has literally made it rain blood. All you need is just to play some Slayer over that. That's all you gotta do. All you just need is Slayer as a soundtrack. Right? Or you have this clip here from another Samurai Showdown game, where you have, I think it's Jubei just cutting poor Nakaruru to pieces, In my personal opinion, having grown up playing violent 90s fighting games, I don't find what's displayed here any more violent than the Eternal Champions games, which were fairly violent for for the day. So I find it interesting that this was permissible in Japan, uncensored. Again, another Samurai Showdown game. But when Mortal Kombat gets ported over, it has to be censored. Maybe I'm just picking at an old scab, but it's like it just doesn't make sense to me. If this is permissible at home in the home country, why is the American equivalent more or less a problem? I'm just saying, what up, Japan? What up? But anyhow, my point in all of this is that there will always be some sort of censorship. There will always be some sort of content control. And this is going to change and be very dependent on, first of all, who's in power, right? Because governments change all the time. And governments, how do I put it? Right? A more liberal government might be more open to things. A more conservative one might be a little more not so open to things. But also cultural norms and standards change. And what was considered out of bounds or risque years ago may not be so now. You can look at this just through the history of entertainment, media, fashion, right? There was a time when miniskirts were considered risque, right? And women were daring if they wore one. Now it's just considered a staple of most women's closets. And then, of course, all these examples that I went through, in particular the violence in video games, what was once seen as obscene, right, is now commonplace. In fact, there are games out that are much more violent than Samurai Showdown or the early Mortal Kombat games or Eternal Champions. And many of those games that are much more violent than those titles are often rated teen these days. A good example, in my opinion, although it's not a fighting game, is the Uncharted series. At least the earlier titles. I remember speaking to my brother about it all the time. I'm like, how in the world did this game, with all of its violence and all of its profanity, get a T rating, while Metal Gear Solid, which was nowhere near as violent and nowhere near as profane when it came to the language, got an M, right? There's a perfect example. What was once considered mature, right? Something else, at least in my subjective opinion, came out that was content-wise worse, and yet that was only a teen. So, long story short, there will always be content issues and censorship and debates over what is acceptable to display in the public space and what is not, and all this. Right? So, let's just get that established. It's always going to be an issue. But here's the thing, right? Let's get to the One Angry Gamer article in particular, because what they want to do in Australia, or at least what two MPs in Australia want to do, is go beyond just debating what is permissible to display in a work, right? So here is a clip from the article. I know it might be hard to read. I apologize for that, but link is in the description. But it says here, and again, this is from One Angry Gamer. Many people have covered this already. When the media train gets rolling behind calls for censorship, it's hard to get it to stop. It usually requires a concerted effort from the community to put the roadblocks down and yell, "Yield!" to all the interlopers attempting to co-opt a culture that does not belong to them. We're seeing the seeds being planted right now by Australian members of parliament who are making moves to not only get anime and manga they deem exploitative of children banned in Australia, but they're also collaborating with pressure groups in Japan to get the laws fixed to ban certain anime and manga in the homeland. Australian outfit abc.net.au is reporting that South Australian Best Upper House MP Connie Bonaros is working with Centre Alliance South Australian Senator Sterling Griff, what a name, to either get the Australian Classification Board to overturn ratings for certain anime and manga, or to pressure them into being more aggressive in banning anime and manga they claim contains child abuse material. Bonaros explained to the media they are effectively regulating this material like they would a video game or like they would a film, but they are doing so in isolation of our criminal law. Our federal criminal code clearly says that this material would meet the definition of child exploitation material and therefore should not be available at all. You have Astro Boy and Pokemon, and in amongst all that material, there are titles which clearly contain material that meets the definition of child exploitation material. The targets of Bonaros and Griff include Manga Sensei, No Game, No Life, and Sword Art Online, to name but a few. Now, here's what concerns me about this. Many things concern me. Number one, the idea of a ban. I think that when you start using the word ban, right, you start wanting to swing the ban hammer, you're going entirely too far. Especially, as the article points out, when it comes to works that are not from a culture that is your own. Number two, and here's what concerns me about this. What concerns me about this is everything that is not said. For example, right, it says here in the article that our federal criminal code clearly says that this material would meet the definition of child exploitation material. But it doesn't give an example, at least in the quote. But I read the article and I didn't see any references to it. And I've seen other videos and articles and I still haven't seen any reference to what actually, first of all, what the actual Australian law code about child exploitation material is. How is that defined? What's an example of it? And how these three manga and anime that have been mentioned meet that standard. And especially when it comes from politicians, I'm always very concerned with what they don't say, with what they don't bring up. Because my question is, especially with this child abuse material. Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing about child abuse material. How do you define that? It might sound simple, right, on its face, but then when you get down to the nitty-gritty, what exactly is child abuse material? Are you talking about the physical abuse of a child? Are you talking about the sexual abuse of a child? Are you talking about the mental and emotional abuse of a child? Can no works show children being abused? What about works about war? Right? War makes victims of everybody, including children. Can you now not show that because it might fall under child abuse material? What about, for example, autobiographies written by people who have experienced child abuse of some sort? Let's take, for example, Maya Angelou, right? She wrote a famous book years ago, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And I remember reading this because it was assigned reading material when I was in 9th grade, so I remember this very well. And one of like the big things about the book for us teenagers was that there was, at least to our minds, a very graphic sex scene, right? She displays she describes in the book exactly how her sexual abuse happened, right? She talks about how she was raped by, I believe it was a male family member of hers. and how this went on for some time in her life. So let's say somebody wants to introduce this book as reading material to Australian high school kids. What do you do about this book? Do you ban it? Do you edit it to remove the references to sexual abuse? But then you're going to impact the message of the story. That was a part of her life. It was a huge part of her life, a tragic one, right? To be fair, but still a part of her life, her lived experience. You would effectively be lying about her life if you take that out. So what do? Right? Once you sit down and you think about these things and you ask yourself, well, okay, what is child abuse? For example, what about the book Lolita? Right? That's about a very inappropriate relationship between a teenage girl and an older man. What do you do about that? What do you do about, for example, history class? Right? Because the cultural norms that we have today didn't exist, 1,000 years ago. The ancient Greeks used to practice, pederasty, right? Sexual relationships between grown men and like young boys, like teenagers. So did the samurai with the practice of shudo. Right? And that was perfectly normal. That was perfectly acceptable in those cultures at that time. Do you not share this? Do you not tell this to high school students and middle school students in history class? Because it's, by today's standards, child abuse material? What do? Right? When you sit down and you think about it, it's not quite so simple a question to answer. And that's one of my concerns with this potential ban in Australia, is that it's running on emotion, but no one, at least from my perspective, no one seems to be sitting down and actually thinking about, excuse the background noise, thinking about exactly what the domino effect might be if this ban goes into effect. Because it's not just going to be on video game. Well, not video games in this case. It's not just going to impact anime and manga. It's going to, as these things often do, reach out into different areas: TV, video games, books, education, so on and so on and so forth. But ranting over, moving on. Right? I wanted to look at the 3 series that were mentioned. So I looked over Manga Sensei, No Game, No Life, and Sword Art Online. Because when I first heard about these 3 and this proposed ban, I will admit, my first thought was, oh, okay, these are probably like ecchi works, right? For those who are not too familiar with anime and manga, in ecchi work is one that is like very sexually charged, right? It's not just fan service. Fan service is when you have a work that has a certain tone, and then there will at times be moments where they sort of, again, try to please the fans, whether it's a shout out. Oftentimes it's a very pretty girl in a provocative pose, but those are like spaced out, right? Ecchi is more like fan service all the time, right? The sex is part of the joke. Like an American version, at least in my opinion, of the ecchi theme, right, or style, although it was a movie, would probably be stuff like American Pie, right? The sex is the joke. But anyway, I initially thought these were ecchi titles. I'm like, okay, they're overreacting, but I kind of understand. Ecchi is very adult, it's very sexual in nature. What was I proven wrong? These, at least from best I can tell, are not ecchi titles. But I did notice one thing about them. They all have these very cute, very innocent looking female characters drawn in what's known as the moe style. Right now, to my understanding, right, the moe style, as we see here with child Raftalia, isn't she so cute? Right, but the moe style is a Japanese art style, right, or art technique which emphasizes youth and femininity and, in particular, cuteness, right? It makes characters look very innocent, right? And it sort of provokes and awakens that almost protective, at times almost parental instinct in someone, right? And it's a big thing in Japan. It's long been part of Japanese art and Japanese culture. Japanese art, from best I can tell anyway, of what I've seen from years of reading manga and and watching anime, Japanese art in general tends to lean toward the beautiful in a very feminine sense and the youthful. And here's the thing about the moe style. It can be used for girls and it can be used for boys. Although this boy, Haku, from Naruto, looks like a lady, right? But it fits in with that art style, right? Very feminine looking, very cute, right? Although it looks very sad here, right? And that's the one thing that seemed to be a commonality, that they all had this moe look. But here's the thing. As many commenters such as Clownfish TV have mentioned, just because a character is drawn in a certain art style does not mean that they, as a character in a narrative, are reflective of that art style, right? A character, especially in anime, right, can look like they are 12 years old, if that, but then really be of an entirely different age. I think there was actually one manga, an anime that actually touched upon that. I think it's long time, but I think it was what is it, Detective Conan? I think it was called. Right, the idea is that somehow he got like transformed into a child, but is really a adult man. It was weird, right? But a lot of works in Japan, regardless of the official stated ages of the characters, will have certain characters have this very soft moe appearance. That does not mean that the character in and of themselves is exploited, or is. It seems to me that this ban, or rather this proposed ban, I should say, seems to somehow be fueled by this idea that this art style, right, this particular art style, right, the very cute, innocent-looking moe type of thing, that the art style is somehow exploitative of children by nature, when it's not. And besides, the West has its own version of moe too. It's called Disney. Disney has long made their princesses look younger than they really are. Look at, for example, Snow White. She's supposed to be what, 14, I think? She looks like she is 12. Look at Jasmine from Aladdin, right? Jasmine's actually supposed to only be 14 in that film. 14. That girl does not look, nor does she behave like a 14-year-old. And hell, she kissed Jafar. Let's not forget that. She kissed Jafar. 14-year-old girl. You don't hear outrage, do you? I think like the first adult Disney princess I can think of that I remember seeing, who's actually grown up, was Pocahontas. And they made a point to make sure she looked like a woman. Of course, the irony of her, of all people, being the one of age princess at the start of the film is that the real lore and story about her, she was like 10, 12 years old when she met John Smith. So this was the age up of age ups. Right? But my point in this little rant is the fact that a character's design or appearance or the art style that they are drawn in is not immediately indicative of their age. Sometimes it can be, but not always. This is why you need content and context. But moving on, right? What concerns me is that, especially since of the whole child abuse angle, right, and child exploitation angle, is that I'm concerned that many anime and manga that feature, I guess you could say, provocative or risque themes or events in the book will be misrepresented, I guess you could say. For example, Goblin Slayer, right? Goblin Slayer received quite a bit of pushback, at least in America. I don't know how it was received in Japan, but I know in America, when it was released in like 2018, it caused some waves and ruffled some feathers because it featured instances of rape. I think like in the first episode or in the first major story, there's a rape, and there were people, of course, the netizens of Twitter, who were arguing that because the story, I should say, because it's in the anime and the manga, that because the story features rape, that it must therefore encourage or promote rape, which is not true. That would be like arguing Berserk is a story that is pro-rape just because it shows the character of Casca being raped by Griffith when he's in femto form, I think it is, right? Just because it features a rape does not mean it is pro-rape. Berserk is one of the most adult things out there. It's going to feature very adult themes and situations, and guess what? Sex and rape are two of them. It does not mean that it encourages such things just because it features them. For example, it's not as if Casca came out on the better side of this after she was raped. The poor girl lost her mind, right? But then you have works like Rurouni Kenshin, for example, right? Here's the thing, right? Eventually, Kenshin and Karu get married and start a family. Here's the thing, though. Kenshin is like 28 at the beginning of the story, and Karu's 17, right? In today's world, that's a very, very, very questionable age gap. But in late 1860s Japan, right? Right after the end of the Tokugawa regime, this was not something to question. And this again gets to my point about, what's the word I'm looking for? About content and context and how things change, cultures change, right? This was acceptable back then. It certainly wouldn't be acceptable now, even in Japan. But here's the thing. I'm not concerned personally that Nobuhiro Watsuki, who is the mangaka for the series, had Kenshin and Karu fall in love and have a child and get married and have this age gap. Nor am I bothered by the fact that Misao, who is 16, has a crush on Aoshi, who's like 11 years her senior. He's like 26 or 27, I think. That doesn't concern me. Misao crushing on an older man, guess what? Nearly every girl does it. That's not the problem. You know what concerns me about Nobuhiro Watsuki? What concerns me about him is that time he was arrested for possession of child porn. That's what concerns me about him. Not this. This. I'm concerned about what the man has actually done. Not the stories he's written. The stories he's written are fine. There's no child exploitation, at least that I know of, in Rurouni Kenshin. But the dude was busted for possession of child porn. There's your problem. What people are actually doing. Not what they may or may not address in a work that you very well could misunderstand or be taken out of context. For example, let's use FMA as an example because I love it. If I wanted to, I could totally mischaracterize Hiromu Arakawa. I could use clips from the manga, clips from the anime, to argue that she sexualizes teenage girls and that she violently abuses the adult women. Here's the thing though, to make such a lie appear to be true, I would have to overlook Lanfan, right, who is one of the few non-alchemist characters who can actually hang with one of the sins here. This is gluttony. I would have to overlook Major General Armstrong, who may as well be the Saito of the series. I would have to overlook Azumi Curtis, who is a loving wife, teacher of the Elrics, tosser of bears, and tosser of homunculi. I would also have to overlook Winry and Riza's actual roles in the story, which are actually quite prominent. For example, Winry and her family, right, represent the only family and the only home the Elrics really have for not even the majority of the story, but for the entire story, right? She serves as their literal and figurative home. When the series finally ends, and Ed and Al are whole again, they go back to Winry's house because Winry is home to them. And then, of course, almost forgot. And then, of course, there's the fact that Winry serves a very important support role in the series as an emotional and practical support to Ed, giving him his arm to use and his leg to stand on. So she plays a most important role. She's the one keeping the hero of the story, or at least one of the heroes of the story, up and running. And then, of course, there is Riza, who is not only the source of Roy's alchemical power, but also serves as his conscience when he's too blinded by rage to see clearly. Right? As I've been saying several times at this point now, if content is king, context is God. You need both if you're going to evaluate a work, especially one that is not your own, that comes from a culture you are not a part of and are not familiar with. It reminds me of what John Tobias said, right? Which he says here, and this is what I think a lot of these, what these MPs in Australia and what a lot of banhammer people here in the States do, which is, and this is his quote, so I'm going to read it. He said, or he said this, he was talking about Mortal Kombat 2, I think. So this is long time ago, but I think it still applies, which is, he says, I think a lot of the attention the game got in regards to its violence came from people who never played the game and weren't really aware of the subject matter. They weren't looking at it as a player. They were looking at it as an outside observer who doesn't play the product. Even with games today, if someone doesn't play a game, is shown snippets of a game, their reaction is going to be different than actually sitting down and experiencing the game. If you look at it out of context, it's worse than it actually is. And I firmly agree with John here. It's very easy, as I just demonstrated with the FMA example, to take snippets, to take still frames, right? And say, this is what this show is about. And use that one still frame out of context, out of order, out of sequence, to craft an argument that is not necessarily true. And especially when you are talking to people, as these MPs are, as these banhammers in America often do, talking to people who are not consumers of the product, whether it be video games, as John Tobias highlights here in this quote, or whether it's anime and manga. It's very easy to convince someone who does not consume the product that the product is bad, right? it's not so easy if you're talking to somebody who's actually familiar with it. And that's the problem. They aren't trying to convince, in this case, anime and manga fans, because they know anime and manga fans aren't going to see things their way. They're trying to convince people who are not familiar with the medium at all to see things their way. And that, in my opinion, is just being just plain dishonest. And I hate dishonesty. Now, here's what I think. I think that a ban is overreaching, going way too far. Because here's the thing. There's a reason why you have things like this warning here, which says that the following content may contain elements that are not suitable for some audiences. Accordingly, viewer discretion is advised. I think if they're going to do something, and they want to do a lot, right? If that article is still accurate and still applies today, I mean, the article stated that not only did they want to ban these two MPs in Australia, they also wanted to convince the Japanese themselves to censor their own work. So I firmly disagree with. You don't have the right, I think, especially as in this case the foreign country, to tell the country of origin how to make their own entertainment. Besides, and you see this here a lot in America, a lot of companies and a lot of creators will censor themselves because they want to be part of a more international market. We see it all the time with Hollywood and their love of the Chinese box office. So they tone down, or they flat out remove things from films that the Chinese audience, and more likely the Chinese government, given how restrictive the Chinese government is, right? They try to tone down or remove things that China might find offensive. So here's the thing. If Japan wants to change their work to be part of the Australian, or rather to appeal to the Australian audience and to appeal to the government suits, right, in the Australian Parliament, or however the Australian government system works, right? If they want to convince those people, the suits, then they'll just amend the work on their own. You won't have to convince them. But to go over and to try to tell them how to make their own work, no, honey, you're just crossing all sorts of lines and all sorts of barriers, in my opinion, with that one. But all that said, another issue I have with a ban is that a ban, right, takes the offending item off the table, right? Now makes it generally inaccessible. First of all, if it's generally inaccessible, that means that individuals cannot evaluate it on their own. When you ban something, in my opinion, what you do is that you take agency, you take autonomy away from the individual, because whether you mean to or not, I think when you ban something, you are effectively telling all these people, right? Or rather, in this case, when you propose to ban something, I want to make clear, to my knowledge, this ban hasn't actually gone into effect. It's just a proposal. Last I checked. But in my opinion, when you propose a ban, what you're telling an entire nation of people is, you cannot be trusted to make decisions about what you find entertaining, or about what you find to be decent and acceptable in the media you consume. We don't trust you enough to make the right decision, because we don't trust that you'll make the decision we want you to make. So when you strip people of their autonomy, well, I get concerned. And yes, this is a way, in my opinion, to strip people of their autonomy, of their ability to make decisions, of their ability to choose. Because here's the thing, not every person is going to look at, say, I already featured this, so I'm just gonna use it. Full Metal Alchemist. Not every person is gonna look at FMA and have the same opinion. Some might find it too violent. I can understand that it's a very violent anime and manga. It's a very violent story, right? Some may find it too violent. Some may find it too graphic. Some may find it not violent or graphic enough, right? Some may say that the instances of fan service take away from the story. Some may say that the instances of fan service are, little lighthearted moments and they're very infrequent. So it doesn't matter. People are not going to have the exact same reaction to a work. Which is why if you're going to try to censor something, right, then at the very least, I am of the opinion that where applicable and where possible, respect the viewer's autonomy, respect the viewer's intelligence, give them the right, give them the ability and the chance to make up their own minds about it. In other words, let them use their discretion. Let whether or not they individually consume this media be at their discretion, not yours. The only place this doesn't apply is with minors, right? You're the parent. If you don't want them watching something or reading something because it's too violent or too sexual or occult or anything else, that's your right. But assuming that we're not talking about kids, let the people decide for themselves. And another thing is that when you ban something, whether you intend to or not, you drive it underground. A good example from American history is Prohibition. Prohibition actually was enforced for what? I think 13 years, from like 1920 to like 1936. Right? And it was passed because there were people, religious groups of the day, interestingly enough also the first wave feminist movement, who thought that if they were able to get alcohol, for the most part, banned, right? Because it wasn't, for example, you could, I think the making and consumption of alcohol was still permissible at home. And if you used alcohol for religious purposes, for example, people say maybe commemorating the Lord's evening meal, drinking wine, right? You could still do that, but like, going to like a saloon, like a bar and, drinking, that was outlawed, right? So when they effectively banned, right, alcohol and alcohol related industries like bars and saloons, because the thought process behind it at the time was, well, these places are, dens of sin and ill repute, and it contributes to crime and public nuisance and public issues with public decency and all this other stuff, right? So if we ban it, then people, can't do these things, right? Well, here's the thing. All that ban really did, right, was force the alcohol industry underground. And once the alcohol industry was underground, organized crime, in particular the mafia, got their grubby paws on liquor. They unknowingly, unintentionally created a black market economy which the mob could benefit from, could profit from. And that gave rise to mobs in New York. It gave rise to mobs in Chicago, in particular the Chicago Outfit. Of course, one of their most infamous members was Al Capone, capiche? Right? But this is what happens when you ban something and you create a mystery and an allure around it. You don't get rid of it, you just put it underground. And then people become curious and they want to know why it's underground. Why is this so dangerous now? Now, realistically speaking, do I think that if this ban goes through, that it's going to create a black market that's going to fuel Australia's organized crime? No, I don't. But I do think that they might get hit with a heavy dose of the Streisand effect. I think that this is going, if it gets passed, I hope it doesn't, but I think that this is going to blow up in their face. I think if they go through with it and if it lasts any time, it's going to end up what's referred to in economics as a perverse incentive, which is basically good idea, terrible execution, has a very unintended and often negative outcome that impacts a lot of people. Except that in this case, I think the idea itself is bad, especially when they can, at least to my knowledge, they cannot produce any examples of how Sword Art Online and Manga Sensei and No Game No Life actually violate their laws. But anyway, that's the video. It's a really long one. Let me know what you think, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a good night, everybody, or a good day wherever you are. Bye.